As we begin this last video in the series, I want to begin with a disclaimer. For me, in starting the Bush presidency, it's more current events than it is history. History is based upon the interpretation of the past, and it's based upon the documents from the past. And most of the documents from this period are still classified. The issues are still close to many people who lived through it. They feel a passion for this time period that can lead to heated discussions and debates. And so today, as we prepare the video on the Bush presidency, I want to focus on specifically what happened rather than the interpretation of it. And so it's going to be a little bit different than in the past videos. And it's going to be less analysis, especially when we get to the wars, because this is a source of real conflict today. And so as we progress through that, keep that in mind, that you need to couple this with the readings from your text to get a more full picture of the Bush years. So let's begin with George W. Bush and his quest for the presidency in 2000. President Bill Clinton had served his 2 terms and had reached the end of his tenure in office. I know many people were counting the days. Others wished it would go on forever, especially those pundits in newsrooms. They absolutely loved the Clinton years. He was a source of information. He was a source of entertainment. Having known some people who know President Clinton personally, they say he's one of the funniest and most engaging guys in person that you could ever want to meet. That he's incredibly brilliant and sharp. But his time in office is over, and as he looks toward the future and his successor, certainly his vice president, Albert Gore, was first amongst the candidates for the job. And Al Gore wins the Democratic nomination and chooses a longtime Democrat and independent, Joe Lieberman, as his running mate. Lieberman being from New England, Gore being from the South, it was a good team. In the Republican primaries, there was a fairly large field, but the front runner that emerged from the primary was George W. Bush, the governor of Texas, and the son of former President George Herbert Walker Bush. Thus, as many media folk have mistakenly said over the decades that Bush was president and since, he is not Bush Jr., and the previous Bush isn't Bush Sr. They have different names. It's George Herbert Walker Bush and George Walker Bush. So it's proper to call them elder and son, or elder and latter. You can call them George Herbert Walker, you can call it GW, or as most in Texas called him back in the day, W. And in fact, that was his presidential logo, was the simple W. And so George Walker Bush, son of former President George Herbert Walker Bush, wins the nomination and chooses as his vice president Richard Cheney, who had been Secretary of Defense in his father's administration, and a former congressman, a member of the Ford presidential team. Richard Cheney had served a long time in government. And as the media said in the day, it gave the young Bush gravitas because he was not and had not held a lot of chief executive offices in the federal government, but he had been a popular long-serving governor of Texas. One of the issues that immediately comes up in the election is whether Bush and Cheney can run together, because they both had houses in Texas. But Dick Cheney had his residence legally in Wyoming. And so it was determined in the courts that they could run together, since Bush was technically from Texas and Cheney was from Wyoming. But this was only the beginning of problems with the election. On election night, and I remember this well, on election night 2000, my wife and I had gone out for dinner as the polls were closing in the Central Time Zone. We were sitting at a restaurant chosen because of its TVs. I'm a political junkie. If you haven't figured that out, I like being involved in politics and watching the electorate shape up. And as we are watching the returns start pouring in from the Central Time Zone, and there's a problem. And the problem was Florida. ABC News called Florida for Gore. And I told my wife as we're eating dinner, I said, it's over. Bush lost. If he couldn't take Florida, Florida's going to be the key. Well, then as we're eating, Florida goes back to undecided. And then over the course of the night, it remained undecided. I remember I stayed up on election night till 2 a.m. waiting for something to be decided on Florida, and nothing was. And in fact, it would be days later, glad I didn't stay up the whole time, but it would be days later before they decide the issue in Florida. So before we get to the issue of the hanging chads, and we're going to take a closer look at those hanging chads and what it means to be a hanging chad and the ballot itself. So in looking at this election return and looking at the ballot itself, there was an issue even before we got to that. ABC News called Florida based upon the portion of Florida that's in the Eastern Time Zone, and Florida has a panhandle that extends into the Central Time Zone. And so in ABC News calling Florida for Gore, there is a host of documented evidence that voters simply left the poll, that there was no reason to stay and cast their vote if it was just going to be wasted. And the panhandle of Florida was Bush country. So in calling the Florida panhandle for Gore, it sent a lot of Bush's support home. And then when they moved it back to undecided, the polls had closed in the central part of Florida, and they couldn't go back and cast their vote. So keep that in mind as we take a closer look at the ballot itself. The problem stems from the butterfly ballot, and that's what you have here. And looking at the picture on the left, it is a book. They are hard cardboard pages put in a metal casing that as you turn the page, it opens up a new center column. And underneath that center column is a punch card like you see the man looking at. So the first column is your presidential race, then your second column would be any senatorial race, then your third column would be a local representative, a federal representative, and then you get into your state races. As you make your selection, you have a stylus that looks like a push pin with a very large head on it. It's usually attached to the machine by a lanyard. And you would make your selection, and you could see, you read the ballot, and then you're supposed to follow the arrow over to the hole, and you push the stylus through the hole, and it punches out the chad. And you can see on the close-in representation of the ballot, the hole that's clearly punched out. Now, one of the complaints about the ballot machines, and these were used all over the United States, not just in Florida. In fact, I remember, I think in this very election in Texas, here in Smith County, I used a push pin ballot just like this, a butterfly ballot. By the next election, they had changed over, but this was exactly what was used across the country before they spent a lot of money updating the machines. Well, the problem comes in is that especially in Florida, because of a lot of superannuated voters, that's a fancy term for old people voting, they wanted to cast, or at least this was the argument that was made by the Democrats following the indecision in Florida, that people didn't want to vote for Bush, and so they look at the ballot on the left that Al Gore is the second person listed, and so they move down to the second hole and punch it rather than following the arrow to the appropriate hole. And so Pat Buchanan got a large number of votes in certain areas of Florida as a third-party candidate, as a Reform Party candidate, in excess of what he really should have received. Now, first off, that's unfair to Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan is an old-school conservative, more conservative than anybody on the ballot, and he was extremely popular with New Yorkers who had retired to Florida. And that's the area in which these ballot irregularities appeared. And so it was said that many of those votes cast for Buchanan should have been cast for Gore, but they punched the wrong hole. Well, then the question is, how do you know? How do you know that they intended to do that? Because they said, well, you know, how did they know that it was an issue? And in fact, it was discovered that there were Democratic operatives in those areas specifically going around asking questions about this very issue days ahead of the election. And so preparing to make this kind of challenge even before the election occurred. So for those of you who still hold out that this election was somehow stolen from the Democrats, there's a lot of evidence going against you on this. And so the question then becomes, in examining the ballot post-mortem, how do you know what they intended to do? And so then came in the issue of whether it was punched, which you see on the left in the inset picture, clearly punched, or in the middle, what was called a pregnant Chad, which meant they rested the stylus against. They were making a decision. Do I vote for Bush or do I vote for Buchanan? They rested their stylus on Buchanan, and then before they push it in, they stop and then punched Bush. And that's why you see Bush totally punched out and Buchanan just dented. But the argument was on others that the Buchanan vote should have been a Gore vote. And so they, as the election night wound down and the vote was extremely close, and I'm not going to get into numbers, but a few thousand separating the two, it became too close to call. So in certain counties, they began a mandatory manual recount. Well, with these accusations for voter problems with the machines, they began a hand recount, and you can see the election official examining the ballot with a magnifying glass to try to determine voter intent. And so the two court cases you see, the Bush versus Palm Beach County Canvassing Board, is a lawsuit brought by the Bush team to stop the hand recount. The court, in fact, approved it. And the reason the Supreme Court approved stopping the manual recount is because the counties that were engaged in hand manual recounts were using different standards as to what was considered a good ballot, what was considered an irregularity, and every time they counted, the numbers changed on how the vote went. Another problem with these ballots, what do you think happens? Look at his hand. This ballot is a punch card ballot. There's very little holding those punches in. Every time you handle these ballots, Chads fall out. And so as the recounts progressed and they call for a second recount and third recount, Bush just finally said, we got to take this to court. We got to stop these recounts, not because I'm losing votes, but because every time you recount, it changes the outcome of the election. Bush won the Florida vote the first time. He won in every recount that they did, but each time they recounted, because of the different standards, it got closer and closer and closer. And so the final court case, Bush versus Gore, is the Supreme Court hearing the case on who should get the vote. Should there be a revote? Should there be a reassessment of the votes that had already been cast? What should be done about the election in Florida? And Bush versus Gore is the Supreme Court stepping in and saying, enough. The election officials in Florida had certified the ballot according to the mandated procedures by Florida law, and the ballots were certified and submitted to the Electoral College. Challenge is over. And so Gore, still believing that he was rightly due the presidency, that somehow he had been cheated, is forced to step aside, and George W. Bush became president. And it's not the first time in history it happened, but he would be a minority president in that he did not get 50% of the popular vote. Because there is a Reform Party, because as you see on that ballot, there was a Socialist Party, etc., there are multiple candidates dividing up the vote. And so even though he gets like 49 point something percent, it still wasn't over 50%. Gore got more popular votes nationwide than did Bush. But Bush won in the right states, and with Florida added, it gave him enough to win the presidency. If Gore got Florida, Gore gets the presidency. And so President Bush starts out his presidency under a cloud of discontent that somehow he had illegitimately stolen the election. And this is going to undermine his support in Congress and ruin any honeymoon period he would have had into his presidency. He puts together a pretty good team of supporters, retreads from previous administrations. You see Colin Powell, who had been chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was made Secretary of State. The governor of Missouri, John Ashcroft, was invited to be Attorney General. Donald Rumsfeld, who had served in the Ford presidency and in the Reagan presidency, becomes Secretary of Defense. And so he has a fairly substantial brain trust of support. And then, of course, his wife, Laura Welch Bush, and you see them preparing for and then going to the inaugural ball. President Bush's honeymoon in office was short-lived, though, as the nation was rocked by a business scandal that shook American businesses and accounting to its core. The Enron Corporation, which was an energy company in Houston, had been keeping shady business practices. In fact, shortly after it was named one of the rising companies of the future, it was discovered that they were a Ponzi scheme, that they were using a sliding scale and moving money around, and it was with the help of their accounting firm, Arthur Andersen, that they were defrauding investors. Investors thought they were buying into a multi-million-dollar company. In fact, they were buying into a bankrupt corporation. The scandal breaks in 2001. The CEO, Kenneth Lay, is hauled into court, and it shakes American business to its core, bringing about the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, which changes the way investors are informed about how companies are run. It's one of the reasons why when you invest in a 401k with your work or in any company's stocks, they send you regular prospecti, a prospectus saying exactly what they're invested in, what the condition of the company, so that investors are kept informed. And in fact, this proved to be the beginning of a long-term problem during the Bush years, and that is an economic downturn. As President Clinton was leaving office and President Bush enters office, the dot-com bubble of the 90s breaks. And the stock market turns downward. And yet, at least temporarily, President Bush seems to be able to hold the line and prevent an economic recession. And he does this because of the balanced budgets of the Clinton years and because of the surplus that the government is collecting. President Bush sends that surplus back to taxpayers as a tax refund in the hopes of stimulating the economy. And that was followed by an economic stimulus package of sending money to taxpayers to try to stimulate the economy. And it fails. It works at least for a little while. And then the events of September 11th are going to rock the investment world, hits America in its financial center, New York City. And from that point on, recession sets in, and it will plague the Bush years in office. But it really didn't begin because of his economic policies. It began because of the bursting of the dot-com bubble. The initial Bush years were not free from controversy. In fact, one of the first foreign policy problems of the Bush presidency was the crash of a Chinese fighter and the emergency landing of an American surveillance plane. Now, the media love to call this the spy plane incident, but China claims a much larger territorial expanse, and you can see on the inset map. In fact, if we can take a closer look at that inset map, you can see the yellow dot where the crash takes place, and that it's in international waters, but they're in international waters claimed by the Chinese. Hainan Island is a subbase and airbase that China uses to protect the South China Sea from incursions. And the Chinese Air Force regularly buzzed American surveillance craft. And so the Ares II, usually called an Orion, but in the surveillance variant, it was called an Ares. So you zoom back out, you can see that the Finback, which is the NATO call sign for the Shenyang J-8, a flight of Finbacks buzzed the U.S. surveillance plane. Now, I'm not making this name up, and in fact, I'm probably mispronouncing it, but it was kind of the dark humor of the day. The pilot of the plane, Lieutenant Commander Wang Wei, as he buzzed the U.S. plane for the third time, turned into and clipped the American plane, knocking off a section of the rear stabilizer, knocking off the nose cone of the plane, doing severe damage to the American plane. Now, the pilot of the Chinese plane, they said there was a parachute, but because of the damage to the American plane, it looked like he curved under. So if he did eject, he probably ejected into the bottom of the American plane, but his body was never found, and it's almost assured that he didn't survive the crash. But this particular pilot, Lieutenant Commander Wei, had a reputation for flying very close to American craft. not because of his diligence in trying to drive the American craft off. Instead, he was trying to communicate with the American pilots. You see, the Chinese, even to this day, censor the emails and websites of Chinese subjects. And so what he would do is, in trying to communicate with the American pilots, he would write his email address on a postcard, a placard, and he would try to fly close enough and put it in his cockpit window for the Americans to see and communicate with him. And so he had been involved in a number of close calls over the years, but in this particular instance, he collides with the American plane, and it's forced to make an emergency landing on Hainan Island. In making the emergency landing, as they approached the airfield, they began destroying any sensitive intelligence or equipment on the plane. Once they land, they went through about a 15-minute process of destroying all that they could on the plane before the Chinese forced them to surrender. They were taken into custody and kept isolated from one another in cells on Hainan Island while negotiations took place between the United States and China. China demanded that the United States issue an official apology for the death of their pilot. What President Bush, through Colin Powell, did was issue two apologies. One, that the incident occurs, but admitting no guilt, and apologizing, they didn't apologize. They said they were sorry the incident occurred, and they were sorry the Chinese pilot was killed. The Chinese interpreted that as an apology. The Bush administration didn't intend it as an apology. They intended it as an expression of sorrow, not an admission of guilt. And so while that was being played out for 5 days, the American pilots and crew are held on Hainan Island before being returned to the United States. And you can see in the inset picture, their return to the United States. The plane itself, the Chinese refused to let the Americans make emergency repairs and fly it out. Instead, they insisted on it being shipped out, which of course meant the Chinese dismantled the airplane, stole all the technology they could, and then shipped it via a Russian freighter to the United States. And so the Chinese and the United States kind of tit for tat here. All of that was overshadowed on September 11th, 2001, when the United States was attacked, and I'm not going to get into conspiracy theories. I'm not going to I'm not going to drink the Kool-Aid. I know there's evidence out there that it didn't happen according to the official story. I'm just not going to chase that rabbit. Like I said, this is current events. I'm going to go with the standard story. The United States was attacked by Middle Eastern men who learned to fly in the United States and hijacked American airliners. 2 of those airliners were crashed into the World Trade Centers. A third was crashed into a field in Pennsylvania, and the 4th was crashed into the Pentagon. And on that day, the American Republic changed. The United States officially, according to President Bush, and then by later actions of Congress, war was declared on terrorism. And as President Bush said, this was a war that would last decades, if not lifetimes. And that war has been used to fundamentally transform American liberties. In response to the attacks from Al-Qaeda, the United States is going to launch 2 different wars. The first against the training facilities used to prepare the Al-Qaeda attackers in the United States. In Afghanistan, where the ruling Taliban regime supported all forms of state-sponsored terrorism. And so beginning in October of 2001, the United States sent ground forces into Afghanistan to bring about governmental change, regime change. And in fact, our servicemen and women did what they were sent there to do, turning over the government to President Karzai, who established a republic in Afghanistan that was at least semi-loyal to the United States. And that war will continue throughout the Bush years into and through most of the Obama presidency as the United States fights to maintain that foothold in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, I think the gains made are being lost because of our pullout. But nonetheless, we accomplished what we were sent there to do, which was in the reign of the Taliban. The second conflict that spawned from the Afghan war is the war in Iraq. Some have said that this was a continuation of his father's war, and in some ways it was. George Herbert Walker Bush stopped the war before the fall of Saddam Hussein. That wasn't his goal, regime change. It was to liberate Kuwait. But it set up a condition in which Iraq is isolated from the world, and Saddam Hussein desperately wants to avenge the loss and restore his honor. President George W. Bush went to the American people in March of 2003 and told the American people that Saddam Hussein sponsored state-supported terrorism and that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Whether those be nuclear, biological, etc. They were in Iraq, and we needed to go into Iraq, overthrow Saddam Hussein, and liberate those weapons of mass destruction. The problem comes that once we do go in, and once we do win the war and overthrow Saddam Hussein, no weapons of mass destruction were found. Now, I say that a little hesitancy because that's the talking points of President Bush's opposition. But we know there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq because we gave them weapons of mass destruction. All indications are that Saddam Hussein had been supplied with emergency chemical weapons to fight in case the Iranians had invaded. And some of the weapons that are currently being used in Syria, there are indications that Syria got those weapons from Saddam right before the war began. That Saddam quietly shipped them to Syria and hid them out in Syria so that the Americans wouldn't find them. But beginning in March of 2003, the United States invades, using Kuwait as a staging point, invades Iraq, and in a lightning-fast war, captures Baghdad and overthrows the Saddam Hussein regime. Now, Saddam Hussein himself goes into hiding, and the United States spends years looking for him, ultimately finding him. He's put on trial by the Iraqi people for crimes against humanity. And by the way, he was a very bad man. They found many of his torture rooms where he raped and killed people for no other cause besides they were not ethnically of his tribe, killing Kurds and others, Shiites, because of who they were, torturing for information, his sons torturing just for the simple pleasure of torturing other people. He was a very bad man that needed to go down. And then the United States began a long-term occupation of Iraq because they were afraid of exactly what has happened, the rise of an opposition group in the vacuum left by our withdrawal. And so when we withdraw in 2011, we set up the situation where ISIS today has taken root. But our ground forces were successful, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, in accomplishing the mission laid before them. But these are wars that are going to tax the American economy and tax the American people, especially since they're wars that weren't popular when they began. It's kind of the Vietnam syndrome. America becomes exhausted with conflict, and we have turned around and duplicated exactly what we disliked about Vietnam. We win the war in Vietnam, but rather than staying and making sure there's a stable peace, we withdraw, leave a power vacuum in which our enemies then exploit. And we have turned around and done the exact same thing in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Our troops pay for in blood what our politicians aren't willing to then pay for with treasure and continued presence. The Bush presidency was also rocked in his first term by the explosion of the Space Shuttle Columbia. On February 1st, 2003, the Space Shuttle was returning from a mission with the first Israeli astronaut on board. Apparently, by all indication, in takeoff, and you can see the strut holding the shuttle to the main fuel tank, that particular piece was reinforced by an aerodynamic foam bracket. And that foam breaking off, a very brittle foam, but it was foam, impacted the leading edge of the left wing. And so upon re-entry, over the skies of Texas, the Space Shuttle Columbia broke up and debris was strewn from Tyler. And you see the map there. That's a weather map. All of the debris being scattered through Texas and Louisiana as the Space Shuttle rained down upon East Texas. I remember it was a beautiful Saturday morning, and we heard the boom and rushed outside, and you could see. We'd watched the Space Shuttle go over many times here in Tyler. If they were headed for a Florida landing from a certain orbit, the Space Shuttle would pass overhead. It's already entering the atmosphere, and it was like a big purple crayon drawn across the sky as it's passing over. It was just the most amazing thing, moving incredibly fast. Well, this time the Space Shuttle Columbia broke up in the atmosphere and brought the already flagging shuttle program, brought it to probably an even quicker end. Now, this isn't the last shuttle flight. They continue flying the shuttle, but they began phasing it out until today we no longer have any serving shuttles. 2004 was an election year. Senator John Kerry receives the nomination for president, and he chooses as his vice president one of his Democratic rivals for the nomination, John Edwards, a trial lawyer from the South. The Bush-Cheney team run for a second term, and this time around, it's not as dramatic as the first time. President Bush easily wins 286 electoral votes to 251, taking 31 out of 50 states and winning with a majority of the electorate. President Bush, following 9/11 and following in the first part of the Iraq War, is an extremely popular president. His popularity numbers hovered around 93, 94, 95%. One of the most popular presidents that ever recorded. He was also one of the lowest presidents recorded. As his administration wore on and scandals broke and the economic pressures bore down on him, his Democratic opposition portrayed him as a cowboy hick that stumbled over his words. And he did have a problem speaking extemporaneously, especially if they told him not to go out and say something about an issue. You could tell he was struggling to, how do I edge around this without saying what I'm not supposed to say? But in person, he was an extremely likable guy. And those who know him say he has an incredible memory for names, an incredible memory to engage, an incredible memory to sympathize and empathize. And President Bush quite frequently would attend the funerals of servicemen that were killed in action as their bodies returned to the United States. He would go and attend their funerals. He was very, very compassionate with the families of servicemen, injured servicemen. He invited to the White House all the time, more than they ever have published in records. It was a little known fact that he would go visit the VA hospitals in person and not make a public spectacle at it. Since he's out of the presidency, he quite frequently goes in person. I don't mean to opponent, but I want to counteract a lot of the bad publicity he was given, because he made mistakes. And when no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq, it really turned the American populace against him. That he had lied, that they had supported him in the lie. I don't think he lied. But where's the evidence that he didn't? And that proved problematic. And so George W. Bush, as his second time in office, you can see the inauguration. Most of his second presidency is occupied with the economy. It's occupied with the two wars. But then the most catastrophic of events was Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina, hitting in 2005, if my memory serves correct, hitting in the fall of 2005, devastated the Gulf Coast, and it was an example of why you don't want government running more stuff. Government proved incompetent. Local, state, and federal government made mistakes. The federal government pre-positioned supplies, but we do live in a federal system that requires the governor and the mayor to do certain things. The mayor of New Orleans, Ray Nagin, waited too long to issue an emergency declaration for New Orleans. Beyond that, there were hundreds of school buses that could have carried people out of the city to safety, and while he authorized their use, he didn't certify that regular drivers could drive them. Only people with a commercial license for a school bus could drive them. And so they didn't have enough drivers to drive those school buses, whereas if they had turned them over to just anybody who could drive a stick shift or a large vehicle, could have gotten more people out of New Orleans in those school buses and taken them to Baton Rouge or to Houston. And in fact, as the hurricane hits, the problem in New Orleans isn't necessarily the hurricane itself, it's that the levees were breached in something like 50 different places, because once again, the federal government, and not the Bush administration, this goes back way, way back, in constructing and maintaining the levees, used improper material. Used too short of beams and various things. I don't want to get too technical on that. But the levees weren't constructed the way they were designed to be, and under the pressure of that kind of water, they failed. Now, there were stories circulated that George W. Bush hated black people and that he had purposefully crashed barges loaded with explosives into the levee to flood the city. That's just simply untrue. That's scaremongering designed to turn elections against a political party. And it just simply isn't true. There was enough blame to go around without it. The mayor of New Orleans was at fault for not allowing the school buses to be used in the evacuation. The governor of Louisiana, improperly declaring emergencies in Louisiana, was to blame, and then not working with federal services. Governor Blanco failed to work with emergency services, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management, and then Bush himself is to blame for not pushing harder to get assistance in there. Either way, Hurricane Katrina devastated because of the flooding New Orleans and because of the impact of the hurricane itself in the Mississippi coast. I put Waveland, Mississippi on there because that was one of the areas where the eye passed over. And that's where my wife's family, my brother and sister-in-law lived. They lost everything. And then insurance didn't pay off because they said it was a flood, not a hurricane, that the wind damage didn't destroy their house. It was the storm surge pushed by the hurricane. Therefore, the insurance refused to pay. And so my brother and sister-in-law lost their house, everything in it, had to go into bankruptcy to get clear. And thousands upon thousands of people were in that same situation, which President Bush then did go in and allocate funds and low-interest loans and stuff for those who were eligible. But it was still problematic, and it took almost a decade for the damage for Katrina to be cleaned up and restored back to really a livable condition. In the 2008 election, President Bush has served his 2 terms. He's on the way out, and the presidency is open. And a new political figure, a senator from the state of Illinois, Barack Hussein Obama, seizes and captivates the Democratic Party and the electorate in general by his eloquence, by his promise of hope and change. He didn't have to be clear of what he meant by hope and change. What was he going to change? What was he going to accomplish? He didn't have to be clear because he wasn't Bush. And running on the Bush economy, running against the Bush wars, he was able to saddle his opponent, John McCain, with the legacy of the Bush years, and to convince the American public that if you elected McCain, you were going to continue those same policies. And so the American public, with an eye toward history, an eye toward accomplishing something that had never been done before, the election of, excuse me, a black president, flocked to the polls, and in a historically dynamic election, President Obama wins the victory. And I'm not going to go into his presidency because that's way too current, and it's in your lifetime. And so we will end the lecture there with the ascendancy of President Barack Obama.